Welcome to Catholics Today, a production from the Catholic Diocese of Lafayette, highlighting religious programs and the people offering the services to help those in South Central Louisiana. Thank you for joining us. October is Respect Life Month, and the theme is Be Not Afraid. As we prepare for All Saints and All Souls Day in November, we felt it fitting to close out the month of October and air a two-part series. Here is the conclusion of End of Life Matters, a talk by Father Keith Labove.
Welcome all of you. By way of introduction, my name is Father Keith Labove. I am a priest of the Diocese of Lafayette, been ordained since 1981. Over the years, I've spent time in a number of parishes, and more recently, I've been involved in hospital ministry for the last 20 years or so, in various and sundry ways, 6 years or so full-time at Lafayette General, and currently I'm pastor of St. Patrick's Church in Lafayette, as well as part-time chaplain at Heart Hospital of Lafayette and Women's and Children's, which, as you can well imagine, gives me two very different patient populations. At Heart Hospital, most of the folks are my age or older, and at Women's and Children's, well, they're a little younger. As I mentioned, I've been hanging around hospitals for over 20 years now, and that has meant being quite often at the bedside with folks who were facing a variety of situations, a variety of decisions, literally. Over the years, I've also served on various hospital ethics committee and been confronted with not only those kinds of situations, but also involved in making medical ethics policies for hospitals, assisting with that. And so that has given me an excellent opportunity to kind of delve deeply into this, not only from the perspective of what does the church say, and what do the documents say, and what does the teaching say, but also just the lived experience of people when death or injury brings them face to face with decisions that can be very, very difficult. For many people, this kind of directionless direction, it could almost be called, can be frustrating. We all want clear lines. Okay, do I have to do this? Can I skip that? There is one area, this will make those folks happy, that is a very bright line. It's the red line over which one may not cross. And that is when it comes to directly ending our lives. The question is it okay to give pain medication to this patient in order to control their pain, knowing full well that that same medication and that dose will also depress their heartbeat and slow down their breathing? And the answer that the church gives is yes, because we have a long-standing principle that recognizes that sometimes human actions have more than one effect. The seizure medication ended up controlling her heart rhythm, you know? Which one am I intending to do? So you remember a while ago I talked about euthanasia, and one of the things that has to be looked at is what is the intention? As long as the intention is to control pain, it's acceptable to have the additional side effect of perhaps even hastening death, because that's the only way I can control the pain. All right? So we know that it's going to have this effect. We accept that effect because our intention is to control the pain. Now, if I were to give the exact same dose of the exact same medication to the exact same patient, except my intention would be to end their life, that would be euthanasia. If my intention is to control their pain, it's not. You see what I'm saying? Now, there are certain things that the church cautions us about. One of them is if you're talking about controlling pain for somebody who is approaching death, people have a right to prepare for death. So we don't sedate someone, we don't knock them out unnecessarily. We want them to give them that opportunity to make their peace with God, to make their peace with family members or whoever, to prepare for the moments of death. We need a compelling reason to actually sedate someone into unconsciousness if it can be avoided. The other thing is we need to look at the fact that the church understands some suffering to be redemptive. That doesn't mean we pursue suffering for its own sake, But we do know that through the sacrifice of Christ himself, suffering can be a moment of grace. And we try to bring that spiritual insight to the condition, to the situation of that person who is suffering. Okay. All right, that's one kind of gray area. And you can see how, again, we're trying to balance the burdens against the benefits. Another question that people run into when they go into the hospital or when a loved one is there is the question of do not resuscitate orders. Now here I have to point out to you that this is one of the areas in which TV lies. And they lie big time. Okay? When you do a survey of people going into cardiac arrest and getting CPR on TV, about 75% of them make it. In a hospital, somebody going into cardiac arrest and immediately receiving CPR from trained professionals, only about 25% survive the attack. And not all of those people survive to discharge. Okay? When it's out of hospital CPR begun by a bystander, for example, the percentage is even below 20%. Okay? So one of the things that we have to know is the truth about what this treatment is and what the chances are, because again, we're trying to balance expected burdens against expected benefits. One of the things about being in a hospital is calling a code, or a code 9, or a code blue, or whatever that hospital calls it, is something that does not require a doctor's order. We assume that when somebody's heart stops beating, they probably want us to try and start it again. Okay? And most of us do. All right? Somebody's walking down the street, they pass out, their heart's not beating, they probably want somebody to do CPR on them. Therefore, within hospitals, if anybody discovers a patient who has gone into cardiac or respiratory arrest, they call a code. You don't need a doctor's order. You need a doctor's order to do just about everything else in the hospital. Nothing is done to a patient without a doctor's order, not even giving them a Tylenol. It's a very exceptional kind of thing because the stakes are so high. That's why we do confront the question, okay, if your heart stops, do you want us to try and start it again? In most situations, we would say yes. However, again, we're balancing expected benefits against expected burdens. There are situations where the burdens would outweigh the benefits. You know, I've seen people who, with advanced cardiac disease, they're still living. They might live for a couple of more years. But over the years, their heart has been tremendously weakened. Maybe they only have 20, 25% function of their heart. They struggle with congestive heart failure. Over the years, the medications and the tests they've taken have weakened their kidneys. Their kidneys are barely working. Maybe they're diabetic. In that situation, if that person were to go into cardiac arrest, the chances of CPR working are a lot less than they would be for someone who is otherwise healthy. And there are side effects. Oftentimes, especially in somebody who's older or frail, you might crack ribs. When you intubate, put the tube into their lungs, you can cause damage. There's risk of infection. There are burdens associated with it. So it is permissible in certain situations where, depending on that particular patient's condition, it might be totally justifiable to say, listen, things have gotten so bad here, if his or her heart stops, we really don't think it's worthwhile trying to start it again. We are probably going to fail. And there are all these other side effects that are going to take place. And so there are situations when the burdens outweigh the expected benefits. And it is okay in that situation to make the person a no code, to ask the physician to sign a DNR order, which simply means that if their heart stops or they stop breathing, they're not going to call a code. That can happen. It depends on the situation of the patient. Most of us, as I said, would probably want it done. Moving right along. Actually, DNR is the easy situation. The hard one that we want to talk about now is when it comes to questions revolving around artificial nutrition and hydration. That is today the tough one. Many of you will remember Terri Schiavo. She, in 1990, was a 26-year-old woman, collapsed at home. The only reason possibly known for why she collapsed was actually possibly excessive dieting, believe it or not. She had severe brain damage from lack of oxygen to the brain. She was diagnosed with persistent vegetative state, not a coma, and she was in a care facility. She had a feeding tube. She was not on a ventilator. And she had been living that way for about 10 years when her husband, Michael, petitioned the physicians and then the courts to discontinue her feeding tube. And that's when it began to hit the news. Terri's parents objected. They claimed that she was not in the persistent vegetative state the doctors were. They claimed that she was responsive, that they could see her making purposeful movements, this kind of thing. Eventually, this went to the courts, it went through legislatures, maybe you remember it. It eventually went to the Supreme Court. And finally, Terri Schiavo's feeding tube was removed on March 18, 2005. It's quite a few years after the original incident. She died on March 31st, 2005, about 13 days later. The significant thing about Terri's death compared to some of the others we've been talking about is that basically she died from malnutrition and dehydration. Her original injury, the PVS, did not kill her. Terri Schiavo was not terminally ill. She had been living for 15 years with a feeding tube. The thing that really stands out for us, as what we're talking about tonight, about Terri Schiavo, is that case actually led the U.S. bishops to send a couple of questions to Rome. In addition to a rather long quote on artificial nutrition and hydration that I provided on your handout from the U.S. bishops, I also have there, under persistent vegetative state, the questions and the answers that were given by Rome. And this was in 2007. It took place after Terri Schiavo's death. And the question was, is the administration of food and water, whether by natural or artificial means, to a patient in a vegetative state morally obligatory, except when they cannot be assimilated by the patient's body or cannot be administered to the patient without causing significant physical discomfort? The response was yes. The administration of food and water, even by artificial means, is in principle an ordinary and proportionate means of preserving life. One of the reasons they're saying that is in terms of cost, in terms of physical burden, being fed through a feeding tube is not that burdensome. Countless people do it at home. You don't even have to be in a hospital or in a nursing home. It's not that much more expensive than feeding somebody normally, okay? It's not, as treatments go, it's not that burdensome. And so when you're looking at the intended purpose of artificial nutrition and hydration, which is to provide nourishment and water to the human body, the expected benefits will normally outweigh the burdens, because the burdens are not that high. When you compare the burdens, for example, of artificial nutrition and hydration to being on a ventilator in the ICU, you can see that the burdens are much higher, financial, social, physical, with something like a ventilator, something high-tech, and something relatively low-tech like a feeding tube. And so when you look at, again, our same basic principle, balancing the burdens against the benefits, normally artificial nutrition and hydration is going to be ordinary and therefore mandatory. There are exceptions. There are situations when the very provision of the artificial nutrition hydration becomes burdensome. Thinking about the patient with dementia who keeps pulling the tube out. How often are you going to insert it? Okay, you don't want to keep the patient in restraints all the time. That would be inhumane. So that in itself can end up being very burdensome. Or if someone, this probably happens more often, if someone is approaching the end of life, one of the things that often happens is the body begins shutting down, and a person can actually begin Their body stops being able to metabolize the artificial nutrition hydration, the nutrition. It stops achieving its goal of nourishing the person. So if the burdens go up or the benefits go down, it is possible that that same treatment might become extraordinary, it might become disproportionate. And at that point, it would no longer be ordinary treatment, it would no longer be burdensome, it would no longer be mandatory. In many situations, however, at least with the current situation with church teaching, if you've got somebody who has, for example, a stroke or a heart attack, they have some kind of brain injury, yet they're not dying. Maybe they're in a persistent vegetative state, as was Terry Schiavo. The church teaching at the moment is one is required to provide feeding and hydration. And the reason I say that's hard is that most of us don't want to be in that situation. We would really prefer not to. But why does the church say this? It goes back to that bright line that we talked about earlier. Just as when that physician gave Debbie the overdose of morphine and directly caused their death, if I have somebody like Terry Schiavo who is not terminally ill, who's not dying, and I stop feeding her, that's passive euthanasia. It is the lack of nourishment that is ending her life. And I don't see how you can stop feeding somebody whose body is still receiving the nourishment, it's still working, stop feeding them without having the intention to end their life. That's where it gets really, really hard. And that's why I say this is probably the most difficult decision that someone might face. And that's where we are today. Another story. Nancy Cruzan, 1983, automobile accident, ejected from the vehicle, face down in the ditch, lack of oxygen to her brain, in PVS, persistent vegetative state, never wakes up, has a feeding tube. 4 years later, 1987, her parents asked the court to remove the feeding tube. The judge in Missouri, this happened in Missouri, says yes. Missouri fights it. The state of Missouri fights the parents on this. It ends up going all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, all right? And eventually the U.S. Supreme Court decided, and this is important, that Nancy Cruzan had a fundamental right to refuse treatment, okay? However, there was not clear enough evidence that removing the feeding tube was what Nancy Cruzan would have wanted. And therefore, the Supreme Court ruled that without clear evidence of what she would have wanted, she had to be left on the feeding tube. And at that point, Missouri got out of it. Terry remained on the feeding tube through that decision. A short time after that Supreme Court decision, somehow her parents found some co-workers who said that they had heard Nancy saying, I've got Terry on the brain, heard Nancy saying that she wouldn't have wanted to live that way. And given this clearer evidence that that would have been Nancy's decision, it went back to court, and the courts ruled that the feeding tube could be discontinued. Okay? What's significant about that is that the idea was that she had, and we all have, a legal right to refuse treatment. If you walk into your doctor's office, he wants to do something to you, and you say no, he can't do it. That's why you sign all those forms when you're admitted to the hospital in the emergency room. Well, some of them so they can get paid, but some of it is consent. They cannot do anything. You can refuse just about anything. And that right to refuse treatment doesn't go away just because you're unconscious. But the state, rightfully so, by state I mean government, has a compelling interest to preserve life. And so they want clear indication of what you would have wanted. And so it came about that in 1990, U.S. Congress passed the Patient Self-Determination Act, which required all hospitals and healthcare institutions to ask you a question when you were admitted. Do you have a living will? It was out of that Supreme Court decision about Nancy Cruzan that legislation came about and made all of us aware of the whole idea of advance directives. Okay? The idea is behind an advance directive is that I have a right to refuse treatment. And an advance directive enables me to exercise that right to refuse treatment even though I am comatose or in a persistent vegetative state or simply no longer able to personally direct my care. And that's where all of that came from, and that's why we have today a lot more awareness about the possibility of advance directives, or as they're also known, living wills. That's why the hospital asks you that question. It's in order to preserve your right to refuse treatment. Because most people, when they're writing their advance directive, are going to say, in such and such a situation, I do not want this or that. And there you have an advance directive that is legal in the state of Louisiana, says advance directive living will in accord with Catholic teaching. This is the one that for a number of years I have been recommending people. You can take this, get it signed, get it witnessed, and bring it to your hospital, and it is legitimate, okay? Let me tell you where I got it. The top part, the advance directive part, came from a Louisiana bishop's document entitled Approaching Death that they came out with about 15 years ago. And the text of this, not 15 years ago, closer to 10 years ago, that text is directly out of the Louisiana bishop's document. That's where I got it. The bottom part, the durable power of attorney for health care, comes almost directly from Louisiana law, and I chose to add it to the bottom of this form. The reason I wanted to add that section enabling you to appoint a durable power of attorney for health care is I recommend so strongly that if you're doing this, if you're thinking about care for you when you can't make your decisions for yourself, appoint someone to make decisions for you, okay? And this is what get back to the question that was raised a while ago about when you've got a family that disagrees. You could have 6 kids. If you appoint one of them as your decision maker, then that person rules. And that person has the legal right to make decisions for you regardless of what the other 5 kids say. If you've got a spouse and you appoint someone else to be your medical decision maker, then they make the decisions, not your spouse. I'm not recommending that. I'm just using it as an example. Okay? Couple of things about advance directives, living wills. Okay? First of all, you don't need an attorney. The language living will can be deceptive. It's not like a will, last will and testament. It has nothing to do with a last will and testament. Last will and testament is about after you die. This is before. Okay? Do not put it in your safe deposit box. Make 16 copies and give them to your family and friends. Put one on your refrigerator because you need it when you go into the hospital. After you're dead, it does you no good. Okay? An advance directive, this is one form. There are a multitude of forms. The reason I offer you this one is it is in accord with teaching, especially Catholic teaching, especially with regards to nutrition and hydration, and I'll show you that in a second. It can be revoked at any time. An advance directive can even be made orally if you tell your physician what you want and somebody documents it. Okay? So there are many ways to make an advance directive. Written is best. It is your responsibility, if you go to the hospital, to provide the hospital a copy of your living will. Okay? That's why it's good to have copies and to bring them with you. All right? But don't tuck it away in your safe deposit box. All right? The exception I was talking about, in addition to an advance directive, Louisiana passed several years ago. This is relatively new. A lot of people don't even know about it yet. Passed something called Labove. It's Louisiana Physician's Orders for Scope of Treatment. Let me tell you who this is designed for. Most people are not going to need Labove. The person who needs Labove, and you've known people like this, is the person with a chronic illness who tends to move from one healthcare setting to another. Okay? And you've known people. Maybe they're in the nursing home, and then they get pneumonia and they move to the hospital, and they get over their pneumonia, then they go back to the nursing home. And then they might go to a rehab place for a while. And here's the thing, we were talking about do not resuscitate orders. That person has decided with their physician and their doctor that if their heart stops, they've got this chronic condition, they don't want them to do CPR. That's fine, that's their decision. The thing is, when they're out of the hospital, that order doesn't apply. And as they're going back and forth from place to place, a new order needs to be written. Enter Labove. Unlike an advance directive, which is your statement about your wishes, Labove is actually a physician's order. And the reason I brought a copy, and I'm holding it up for you, is they want you to use this orange paper so that it can be identified. And what you do is you get your doctor to fill this out, and he signs it. It's a physician order. You don't do it alone. You do it with your physician. And then you stick it up on the refrigerator so that when you call Acadian ambulance, they walk into the kitchen and they see, these are doctor's orders. They are allowed to follow these doctor's orders. Without this, you call Acadian ambulance, they get there, you're in distress, they have to treat you. You see what I mean? It's a physician's order that you can carry about from place to place to place. Are most people going to need this? No. Most people aren't unless you have this ongoing chronic condition that lasts for a while, you're probably not going to need it. But for those who are in that situation, it can be something and there are a whole bunch of choices on this regarding CPR, regarding antibiotics, artificial nutrition, hydration, et cetera, et cetera. This is the exception I was talking about, where with a normal DNR, it has to be written every time you enter the hospital, okay? This is something that carries from place to place to place. And let me just share this with you in conclusion. For us as Catholics, the core value of human life consists in being created in the image and likeness of God. While many other things, such as relationships, accomplishments, and independence, can enhance and add richness in life, the sanctity of human life does not depend on our accomplishments or achievements. But when one fails to recognize that core dignity of the human person, then abilities and conditions of life take on an exaggerated importance. For example, in our culture, independence of action and personal autonomy are highly valued. However, if one's independence and autonomy are compromised, especially through illness or injury, some begin to question the value of life itself. The life in question is easily judged to be a life not worth living. Individuals or society decide that if they cannot care for themselves or cannot accomplish certain goals of life they have chosen, then life is valueless. Simply being dependent on others for care and treatment is seen as undignified. Quite to the contrary, there is no loss in human dignity when one needs to be cared for by others at the beginning, at the end, or any stage of life, from birth to natural death. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Catholics Today. This program and all programs produced by the Catholic Diocese of Lafayette's Communications Office is directly supported by your contributions to the Bishop's Services Appeal. We thank you for allowing us to serve you.